Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by Richard Ebeling, the BB&T Distinguished Professor of Economics and Ethics and Free Enterprise Leadership at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you, too. You're looking good.
Thank you. Likewise. Well, we've got big relevant news that just happened that makes our conference in Charleston extremely relevant and timely. As you know, President Trump has decided to really initiate a war against an independent sovereign country. That's Syria. That's what you do when you bomb countries. You're starting a war. I think we learned that on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor. That was considered starting a war against the United States. And so Trump fires some missiles in at Syria, and it really makes our conference that much more timely and relevant and important. We're having this conference in Charleston on April 29th from 1 to 5. It's almost sold out. If you're thinking about coming, you ought to sign up and get your ticket. And we've got 4 speakers. We got Ron Paul, Dan McAdams, the president of the Ron Paul Institute, Richard, co-editor of our book at FFF, The Failure of America's Foreign Wars, and me. And so, we've been talking about this since the beginning of FFF, foreign policy, foreign interventionism, the disastrous consequences of empire and interventionism. And here we have the perfect manifestation of what we've been warning against for 28 years or 29 years here at FFF, Richard, that you've got an out-of-control federal government, an out-of-control national security establishment, an out-of-control president, all coming together in a perfect storm to attack a country based on rather flimsy evidence of supposed chemical use against their own people in Syria as part of this civil war that is really no business of the U.S. government. But the U.S. government makes it its business, and it gets us ever dangerously closer to possibly a confrontation with Russia, a nuclear-armed nation. And it really destroys life here at the United States in terms of, now we got to face terrorist blowback possibilities from the Syrians. We're going to see more loss of our liberty here at home. They inevitably import this militarism and the way they behave themselves in these foreign countries here to the United States with things like assassination, indefinite detention, surveillance, all to keep us safe from the enemies that their interventionism is producing overseas. So what we're doing at this conference and what we've done for 28 years, we need to continue doing. I think the upside is that a lot of Americans are now questioning this. Unlike, when we first started FFF, where everybody would just conform to authority and go along with whatever the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA said, I think people are now finally starting to question these forever wars. They're seeing the adverse impact on our liberty here at home and our prosperity, especially with out-of-control spending and debt. And we just have to keep doing more of what we're doing in order to find more people to reach that critical mass that finally says, enough. It's time to restore a limited government republic to our land and dismantle all the interventionism and the entire empire overseas. What do you think?
Well, I think to begin with, a lot of people are talking about an impeachment of Donald Trump. An impeachment because of a supposed collusion with the Russians concerning the 2016 election, or some type of nefarious or illegal or at least unethical payoff to a porn star with whom Trump is alleged to have had a one-night stand. But the fact is, if there were to be grounds for impeachment, it has just occurred, and that is Donald Trump has initiated military action against another sovereign nation without congressional approval. It is Congress that declares war, as well as appropriating the funds for such activities. He has done this on his own initiative, based upon his judgment and that of the executive authorities around him in the military or the State Department. And therefore, he has acted extra-constitutionally. Now, of course, I'm not expecting his impeachment on the basis of him exceeding his foreign policy powers under the U.S. Constitution, because that would require at least a moral indictment of every president, at least since Franklin Roosevelt, who has chosen to follow paths leading the United States into wars, great and small, or brief adventures and interventions in various countries, great and small, for in fact the last 3/4 of a century. His actions are clearly and demonstrably in violation of any authority a president should have under that, as defined by the original Constitution and the precedents of the first 100, 150 years of U.S. history. What this means is that we have another example of what is referred to as the imperial presidency, a phrase that was made up by one of the left liberal democratic historians originally, but is no less necessarily the truth. A president has been accepted more by just sort of omission than any actual statement of support or congressional resolutions. It has been assumed that the president has this wide latitude of discretion in foreign affairs since the end of the Second World War to intervene, to subvert, to attempt to undertake clandestine actions, even to assassinate foreign dignitaries and political leaders to help facilitate the overthrow of government, and to use sometimes clandestinely U.S. military force in this process. Now, what Donald Trump has done is, in fact, just continued in this tradition, where it's presumed that the United States is to be policeman of the world. And in this role, the United States shall decide on its own discretion when is a situation defined as serious or important enough, either to the U.S. or its definition of the stability of the global community, to undertake military actions either directly or indirectly. And this is an instance of it. Now, the deaths that may or may not have been caused by the use of chemical weapons. And I'm even willing to say maybe the Syrians did use the chemical weapons, though they, of course, and their supporters are denying it, but I would trust what the Russians say about as far as I can throw Putin. But the fact is that even if it is true, it's a terrible and disastrous experience, an agonizing death from what all the experts say. But the fact is that this civil war in Syria has gone on for over 7 years. And during this time, it is estimated by the international humanitarian associations that over 400,000 people have died. And most of those people have died through conventional weaponry, bombs, bullets, and so on. Why is it that suddenly the use of a chemical weapon involves such horrendousness of a handful of people, however tragic their individual loss of lives are, compared to 400,000? If you would expect the U.S. to have just invaded and taken over the country and overthrown it. But why didn't it? Because the president is just presumed to be able to have judgment calls, whether it be George Bush or Barack Obama and Donald Trump, to decide when and under what circumstances and in what situations the United States government is to be entering in harm's way American soldiers, the fortunes of Americans, and in fact the possibility of the safety of the country itself. Because as you said, under the right set of peculiar and perverse circumstances, this type of intervention could easily lead to a shooting war between the United States and Russia, which would involve, in principle, an escalation up to and including nuclear weaponry thrown at each other's respective countries, with disastrous effects for the persons and the property and the civilization of the United States. But this is the arbitrariness. It shows how far we have gone from our constitutional roots and bases of what this country was founded upon and which guided mostly the policies of presidents well into the 20th century. The attitude that the United States does not intervene in these types of situations. We wish people goodwill. We offer them our sympathy, our idealistic support, and private citizens of the United States can give their financial or personal support for what they define as good causes in other countries. As we've talked before, and I've tried to highlight, this has happened several times in American history, where private citizens have gone to help causes in other countries because they were drawn to it by one motive or another. But it is not the duty and the right of the U.S. government to put in harm's way the entire people of the United States merely because one man the President of the United States with his advisors said it is necessary to throw American military hardware, bombs, and personnel into another country when it is not involved directly or at least eminently the safety and the security and the lives and the property of the American citizens right here in the territory of the United States. It is the continuation of a bad precedent that has gone on now for almost 3/4 of a century. And its continuance will finally lead to a situation, besides the tragicness of the individual episodes, to some type of conflict between great powers. And it will involve more than just killing or maiming people in other countries, but will come home right to our nation for harm to the people of the country.
Yeah, let me amplify on your first point on the constitutional requirement of a congressional declaration of war. I mean, we have to keep in mind that the Constitution called the federal government into existence. And when it did that, the framers said, here are the restrictions on the federal government. We're calling this government into existence, and here are the limitations, the powers that you will be permitted to exercise. So with respect to the president, the Constitution, and this is the law that applies to public officials. The Constitution says the president shall have the power to wage war, but he doesn't have the power to declare war. Only Congress can declare whether the United States is going to war or not. So even if the president wants to go to war against a particular nation, he is legally prohibited from doing that unless he gets the Congress to declare war. Now, why were the framers so cautious to make that division of power? Well, because they knew that presidents, emperors, kings inevitably get their nations involved in wars. It's the greatest thing, especially for a president who's in crisis. And Trump is in crisis. He's being investigated by criminal justice authorities. There's a good chance he could get impeached based on what he did with the Russia deal or obstruction of justice or whatever. So what do presidents and emperors do when things start going bad domestically? They start wars. And this is what the framers understood. And so they said, we're going to take the power to declare war out of the emperor, out of the president, out of the king. And so here's Trump saying, I don't need to obey that law. You know, I am like an emperor. If I want to just start a war, I can do this. And unfortunately, the custom was established after World War II of breaking this law. You have the Korean War, you have the Vietnam War, and the Korean War, they got around it by saying, oh, well, it's not really a war, it's a police action. Yeah, try telling that to the families of the 40,000 American troops or whatever the number was that got killed in that war. But the fact that the restriction has been violated in the past does not serve as a license to continue violating it in the future. The fact is, you're absolutely right. He is subject to being impeached for violating the Constitution in this regard, and he should be impeached. Now, why is it so important to avoid wars that presidents want to start? Well, Madison points it out. Of all the enemies to liberty, war is the biggest. Now, he's not talking about enemies, foreign enemies. He's talking about the U.S. government itself. That of all the enemies to liberty, war is the biggest because war gives all the powers to the government that is waging that war against their own citizens. And that's essentially how we got the power to assassinate Americans. The president can do that now through his national security establishment. The power to detain Americans indefinitely as enemy combatants in the so-called war on terrorism. Massive surveillance. All of this is part and parcel of these forever wars. The war on terrorism, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. They go on and on. And with respect to what's going on in Syria, yeah, you're absolutely right. It may have been the Syrian regime that did this gas attack, although I'm skeptical because it makes no sense. I mean, Trump had signaled that he was getting out. He said, I want to get U.S. troops out of there. And I think there's nothing the Syrian regime would love more than to see the United States exit the country. And so I'm a little suspicious as to why Syria would initiate a chemical attack like this, knowing how Trump would react. I mean, everybody knows how Trump would react. It was so predictable. And he says, well, now we're going to stay in. So I'm a little bit skeptical. And there are people who are as brutal as the Syrian regime is. I mean, you're right. They're certainly capable of doing this. But so are many of the rebels who are trying to oust the Syrian regime. They wouldn't think twice about using chemical warfare against and killing a few people if it meant that the U.S. has to stay in Syria. because they're committed to one thing: ousting that regime. And once the U.S. Ends its occupation of a part of Syria, there's a good chance that Assad's going to stay there forever, which in all probability he's going to do anyway. But yeah, it's a combustible situation where the United States is in there. I mean, let's face it, Russia was invited in. Now, you and I would never defend any kind of intervention, even by invitation, but at least legally, the Syrian regime invites Russia in. Nobody invited the U.S. in. It came in as part of its role, self-defined role as interloper, intervener, invader, occupier, meddler, and it's adding to this very, very dangerous situation where anything can happen. I mean, let's assume that one of these missiles had gone astray and knocked out, let's say, 100 Russian troops. I mean, and then what if Russia says, well, we need to respond, and they fire a missile at an American ship? Is that where it's just going to stop, Richard? I'm not sure that the U.S. would stop if one of its ships was knocked out of the water with a Russian missile. Then things can escalate very quickly. And this is what I think a lot of Americans don't realize. They're not familiar with how World War I got started. That things can just go out of control without any warning at all, and all of a sudden you find yourselves in a major conflict with two nuclear-armed countries. And once one uses nuclear weapons, even on a limited basis, there's no telling about where it's going to go after that.
Yeah, well, I just want to reinforce something I said and then you amplified, and that is what the Founding Fathers believed. As you were elaborating, what does the Constitution say as to the responsibility of the President and the responsibility of Congress? But is that what they really meant? Well, there's one way to have an indication of that, and that is to read Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention. And if one reads the part where they were debating and discussing this part of the Constitution, that is, who would have war powers authority, there were people at the convention who said, well, you don't know what's going to happen. This should be a power in the hands of the executive, the president. But there were many who said no, that wars are easily drawn into, countries are drawn into wars because of the purposes of their kings and rulers, as you were saying. And the critics of this said that we should clog the paths to war, not open them and make them easy to enter into. And that is the argument that won the day in terms of when the vote was taken, what was established in the Constitution itself. The majority of the people of the Constitutional Convention were concerned, hesitant, doubtful, fearful of giving that authority to the president on his own discretion. And then after the fact, telling Congress and obviously getting appropriation. To preclude this from the start, it was the idea that, yes, the president executes war or military actions. He is the commander-in-chief. But that can only be initiated after an act of Congress that declares war, or even without a declaration of war, at least gives authority for the president to institute and undertake some type of military action abroad, and then financing it. But what does the president do? He undertakes a military action using funds that are either already allocated in the Department of Defense or some huge slush fund for these purposes. And then when the intervention does not immediately end, when does it ever end? You then have a situation where then the Congress feels obligated to, because of the pressures of oppression. Well, the boys are in harm's way. We have to give them what they need. Now, I want to mention one other thing here, and that is that I don't remember who I saw the interview with. It might have been Bolton, the person who is now Secretary of State elect. It might have been him, but I may be wrong. I saw it on one of the networks, where the question is that, oh, I know what it was. It was Rand Paul interviewing or questioning someone at one of the congressional committees recently. And he asked the person who was testifying, does the United States government have the authority to just interfere and intervene anywhere? And the person who was being interviewed at that congressional session said yes. And the implication is that wherever there are American soldiers stationed, it is the right of the U.S. government to intervene because American lives are at stake. Well, this is a catch-22, is it not, Jacob?
Of course.
Because if the president has the authority to send American military personnel virtually anywhere he wants in the world and stations them there, either on a temporary or a permanent basis, and he defines that therefore they are in harm's way or under some imminent or real attack, having placed them in that situation, he then has the authority to use military force to protect them. Well, you know the solution to that, even in that scenario? Don't send them abroad without congressional permission. And if they can't be sent abroad, then you can't even use that rationale. Well, there's an American military personnel whose life is at stake. Of course, we can go bomb somebody to secure his safety. This is the catch-22 mindset that these people use.
Yeah, and the fact is that the U.S. has military installations or bases in about 1,000 countries. Now, you know, how many foreign countries have bases here in the United States? Not very many. In fact, none. But somehow or another, the U.S. claims the authority to have bases in countries all around the world. And, you know, I think it's important to go back to, you know, the type of government that was called into existence. The fact is that presidents through most of the 19th century, even if they wanted to involve themselves in foreign wars in Europe and Asia and Africa, they lacked the means to do so because of the antipathy that the founding fathers and our American ancestors had to standing military establishments. I mean, all you have to do is Google standing armies, founding fathers, and you can, I've got a great compilation of quotes in an article at FFF.org, where the founding fathers hated standing military establishments, permanent military establishments, because they understood this was a great threat to liberty. And it was something that Eisenhower would later emphasize in his farewell address, where he said, this new way of life, the military-industrial complex, is a grave threat to our rights and freedoms and democratic processes as Americans. But what a lot of Americans don't realize is that everything shifted after World War II, that the U.S. acquired an NSA. There was never an NSA for the first 100 and some odd years of American history. Americans would have never put up with that kind of thing. No CIA, no big military-industrial complex, no foreign military bases. It was a constitutional limited republic. Now, okay, so you've got this basic structure, a limited government republic versus a national security state, which is a type of government apparatus that is inherent to totalitarian regimes. But then you have another factor on top of this, and that's the concept of foreign interventionism. Because theoretically, you can have a national security state without a regime that's intervening around the world. You know, North Korea is an example. I mean, they're a national security state, but they're not going out policing the world. So we have a double problem here in the United States. We've got this massive national security state and the philosophy of foreign interventionism. And so the framers, the founders were against the idea of standing military establishments, but they were also against foreign interventionism. And that's John Quincy Adams' famous speech to Congress on the 4th of July, 1821. It's called In Search of Monsters to Destroy. I recommend it for every American to read. This summarized what the foreign policy of the United States was, what the American people was. It says, this government does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Okay, the Syrian dictator may be the worst monster in the world. The U.S. is not going abroad in search of that monster to destroy. Instead, we're going to keep making America as a model of freedom, including, by the way, open borders, open immigration, where if people got out of Syria or anywhere these monsters were, there would be a nation, at least one nation in the world, that would accept them without forcing them back to their homeland. And so here's the double solution to this, is that we stop the interventionism. We bring all the troops home, stop being the world's policeman, but at the same time start dismantling this huge permanent military establishment in order to restore the founding principles of a limited government republic to our land.
I think if I can just sort of put this in a slightly larger context for our purposes, which is sort of enveloping what you've said and I've said, and that is when we're talking about criticizing interventionism, we should understand it in the broader sense. It's the interventionist mindset that whether it is done domestically in terms of policies here in the United States or abroad. It's the presumption that it is the duty and responsibility of government to do things to make the world better, not just to protect people's rights to their life, liberty, and honestly acquired property, so they as individuals can go about their peaceful and private affairs, interacting with others for mutual benefits and gains from trade and the emerging cultural and material betterment of all through that market process. No, the government has to have the authority to redistribute wealth, to regulate industry and manufacturing, to manipulate or actually set wages, prices, or interest rates. And then that premise that the role of the government is to influence the outcomes of the society, separate from the individuals guiding and controlling and interacting with others themselves. The logical extension of that, if America is to intervene at home when bad things are happening, when undesirable outcomes are likely, when situations are less than what someone considers optimal, isn't the logical extension of that the United States then carries out the same premise and principle abroad, remaking the world, nation building, redesigning their institutional and constitutional structures, re-educating the people to have our values and to live our way. Now, are there a lot of desirable attributes and characteristics to American society and culture? I certainly think so. They're the residues of our founding principles that people nominally espouse and sometimes even continue to live. But by what they mean by that is that the world should be made over in what America considers the image that they conceive everyone should have of themselves and should live and practice, which is a dangerous policy. It is a form of global social engineering and central planning, as dangerous as global as central planning and social engineering is when practiced at home. It's the same principle applied in two contexts, domestic and foreign, but the premise comes from one.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I mean, it's Hayek's concept of the fatal conceit of the planner, that I know what's best, not only here domestically for people, I'm going to centrally plan their lives, but I know what's best for foreigners, despite the complexity of foreign cultures, of foreign lands, of foreign laws, and so forth. The American planner knows what's best. And so he goes into Syria and says, man, I think if I can intervene here, I can make this a paradise for people, like I've done in Iraq and like I've done in Libya and like I've done in Afghanistan, that all I got to do is oust this dictator and then I'll just establish this paradise. Well, what they inevitably do, even when they succeed in ousting a dictator, is they just substitute a dictatorial regime. I mean, this notion that, oh, the U.S. favors democracy and so forth, how do they reconcile that with their support of the Egyptian dictatorship? That's one of the most, that's as brutal as the Assad dictatorship is. And here the U.S. is furnishing them with tanks and weaponry and so forth in order to maintain their tyrannical hold on power. Or Saudi Arabia, another classic example of where the U.S. helps out a brutal dictatorial regime. Or in Chile when they installed Pinochet into power. I mean, this is the mind of the central planner, is that he wants order a lot of times. And his concept of order is a dictator. And so what you end up is usually is a worse situation. I mean, you see this in Iraq. Okay, was it bad under Saddam Hussein? Of course, it's always bad under some totalitarian dictator. But look what they've done with the country. I mean, sometimes people are better off in a dictator than they are dead, or where their whole country's destroyed. And this is what the planner doesn't realize, is that fatal conceit that I know best. And he ends up there. And what's fascinating, Richard, is no matter how much they make a mess out of what they do, they continue doing it, trying to get it right the next time.
Well, I don't know if it's real or apocryphal, but I've read several times that there's this story that during the Second World War, during one of his Oval Office press conferences, Franklin Roosevelt was asked by one of the reporters, wasn't it an anomaly that on the one hand we were fighting the fascist dictators in Europe, Hitler, Mussolini, but the United States was supporting the fascist-like dictator of Dominican Republic, Trujillo? And supposedly Roosevelt, with his cigarette lighter, cigarette holder in his mouth, said, Trujillo is a fascist, but he's our fascist.
Yeah.
But that is the attitude. It's okay if he's one of ours, and that's the reason we support Sisi in Egypt. He may be a dictator who overthrew an elected government that was a bunch of religious nuts anyway, the Muslim Brotherhood, but he overthrew them and he set up his own dictatorship that is following the prior corruption policies of plunder, abuse, rights violations. But why do we support him? Because it serves the agenda of the United States to have all these pieces on a global chessboard arranged the way the U.S. government and the bureaucracies and the administration thinks the pieces on the global chessboard should be set up. And that determines whether you're friend or foe, whether we invade your country or subsidize everything you do at home, regardless of how corrupt it might be in your own land. And that is the sickness and the unprincipled, expedient corruption that we have in our foreign policy today.
Yeah, and what we've got to do is think at a higher level. Instead of trying to get better people in public office or trying to decide where we should intervene or not intervene, we got to think at a higher level. What were the founding principles of this country? Why did the founding fathers oppose standing military establishments? Why did they oppose foreign interventionism? What do we need to do to restore a sense of peace and prosperity and harmony and morality to our land? And I think the answer is obvious, that when that happens, when your society's faced with a massive amount of dysfunctionality, loss of liberty, loss of prosperity, it's time to return to founding principles and start reflecting on what those principles are. The founding principle of this country was no big, massive military establishment, in other words, a limited government republic, and 2, no foreign interventionism. But on that note, Richard, we're out of time. Always a pleasure. And by the way, again, we've got our big conference on